The ship should not have been there. That was the first thing Sub-Commander Vreth Alos noticed when the long-range sensor array lit up his console at 0340 station time. A contact, sitting in the buffer zone between consensus-controlled space and the human border systems. Not moving, just sitting there, the way a stone sits at the bottom of a river, patient and heavy and completely indifferent to the water moving around it. Alos had been awake for 2 hours already, which was not unusual. He did not sleep well on patrol rotations. 12 years of this, and his body still treated every night shift like a mild emergency. He was sitting in the command chair of the patrol frigate times, certainty of return times, with a cold cup of grain brew on the armrest, and a transfer request sitting in his personal file that had been denied 3 times in the last 8 months. He looked at the contact on his screen. He looked at his transfer request. He looked back at the contact. "Sensor team," he said, "give me a profile on that contact." The response came back in 30 seconds. It was a human vessel, a Mjolnir-class destroyer, which was a category of warship that consensus tactical analysts had spent the better part of 2 years studying and had still not managed to fully understand. Not because the ships were complicated, because the things the ships did in combat were complicated. The ships themselves were large blocks of metal with engines and weapons bolted to them. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that should have kept anyone up at night. And yet, the contact was broadcasting a damaged vessel transponder signal. The automated kind. The kind that said, "Times we are broken, and we are not a threat. And please, for the love of whatever you hold sacred, do not shoot at us." Every spacefaring civilization used some version of it. It was one of the very few things humans and the consensus had agreed on without a war first. Alos straightened in his chair. He told himself this was going to be simple. A disabled warship. A crew waiting for rescue or retrieval. He would file a disabled combatant report, flag it for higher command, and spend the rest of his shift staring at empty space and thinking about the transfer he was never apparently going to receive. "Full scan," he said. "Level 1. Let's see what we're dealing with." The scan array unfolded from the belly of the times, certainty of return times like something waking up slowly, reaching outward through space toward the drifting human ship. Level 1 scans were broad. They told you size, mass, basic power output, hull integrity. They were the first look. The look that told you whether to be curious or concerned. The results came back. Alos read them. He read them again. "Run it again," he said. His sensor chief, a young officer named Dret who had been on this posting for 4 months and still found Border Patrol interesting in the way that people find things interesting, before those things have had time to grind them down, looked up from his console. "Sir, run the scan again. Check for instrument drift first." Dret ran the instrument diagnostic. Clean. He ran the scan again. The results came back identical. The human ship's primary reactor was offline. Not damaged offline. Not running. At reduced capacity offline. Cold offline. The kind of offline that meant it had been dark for a long time. His system estimated 72 hours based on the residual thermal signature, which was barely a signature at all. A ghost of warmth. Fading. That was fine. Ships lost their reactors. It was one of the things that happened in war. What was not fine was the weapons array. It was active. Not standby. Not powered down into a safe state. Active. Charging. The human ship had a cold reactor. No primary power source that Alos's scan could identify, and weapons that were drawing energy from somewhere and building toward a firing state. Alos picked up his grain brew. It was cold. He put it back down. "That's not possible," Dret said, looking at his own screen with the expression of a man who has just been told that 2 + 2 = 7 by a calculator he personally calibrated this morning. "Run a level 2 diagnostic on our own sensor suite," Alos said. "I just ran the instrument check. Full diagnostic. Not just drift. Everything." Dret ran it. It took 4 minutes. The times, certainty of returns time sensor suite came back without a single fault. Not an error. Not a calibration issue. Not a software glitch. The ship was reading perfectly. The human destroyer still had a cold reactor and active weapons. Alos set his chair to face the main display, the large one that took up most of the forward wall of the command deck. He had the scan data projected there so he could look at all of it at once. Hull integrity. Poor. Roughly 40% structural compromise across the port side, which meant someone had hit this ship very hard recently, and the ship had absorbed it and kept existing. Engine output. 17% on the port side, which was almost nothing. Almost. Starboard engines were at 60%. which was why the ship was drifting in a slow rotation rather than flying in a straight line. She had been in a fight. She had not left the fight. She was still here, in the buffer zone, rotating slowly, reactor cold, weapons charging. Alos pulled up the tactical record for this sector. 6 hours ago, there had been an engagement. A consensus strike group had moved against a human forward position near the border. The report listed the engagement as successful. The human position had been neutralized. He cross-referenced the ship identification code from the transponder signal. The destroyed human position had been defended by one vessel. UES unconditional. He was looking at her right now. She had been declared neutralized in the engagement report. She had opinions about that. Alos told his communications officer to open a long-range channel, then stopped himself. Not yet. He wanted more data first. He wanted to understand what he was looking at before he started talking to it. Level 3 biometric scan, he said. I want a crew count. Level 3 scans were personal. They reached through hull plating and looked for living things. They measured body heat, respiratory rhythms, cardiovascular output. They were used for determining whether a ship had survivors and how many, and in what condition. The consensus used them before boarding actions to know what they were walking into. The scan took longer. 6 minutes. The results came back, and Alos looked at them for a while without saying anything. 23 life signs. All human, all alive, which was already more than the engagement report had implied. Their physical states were elevated cardiovascular output high, adrenaline markers through the roof, cortisol at levels that the standard xenobiology reference classified as times extreme, acute stress response. These were bodies that knew they were in danger. Bodies that were producing every chemical signal that said, times this is very bad and you should do something about it. He understood that. He expected that. What he did not understand was the last line of the biometric report. His translation suite had been running in background passive mode, which meant it was quietly processing any signals that looked like communication. It did this automatically. It had been doing it for years. It had never once returned a result that read the way this one read. Synchronized vocalization detected, 23 subjects. Pattern, harmonic. Classification, unknown. Unknown, Alos said out loud. Dret looked at him. Sir? Alos turned the display toward him. Dret read it. He read it again. What does that mean? Dret asked. Unknown? It means the translator doesn't have a category for it. The translator has 80,000 categories. 81,214, Alos said, because he had read the system manual during a very slow week last year. And it doesn't have a category for this. Alos, he pulled the raw audio from the scan. The biometric sensors did not normally capture audio, they measured biological signals. Not sound, but the vocalization was strong enough, coordinated enough, that it had registered as a signal pattern worth logging. He put it through the translation suite manually, pushing it harder, telling the system to try every framework it had. The system tried. It returned. Musical, ritual vocalization, human origin, estimated composition age, 180 to 220 years. Function, unknown. Unknown again. Alos leaned back in his chair. Outside the forward viewport, the times, unconditional times, continued her slow rotation, patient as a stone. 23 humans with blown-out biochemistry, a cold reactor, an active weapons array, and some kind of group vocalization that his most sophisticated translation software that could parse 6,000 living languages and 1,200 dead ones, could only call times unknown. He pushed the audio to the main speakers. What came out of them stopped everyone on the command deck. It was not what any of them expected. It was not the sound of distress. It was not tactical communication or damage control orders or the sharp, clipped exchanges that his crew used during crisis operations. It was, and Alos did not have a better word for it, smooth, layered. The 23 voices were not talking over each other. They were doing something together, something that required them all to be moving in the same direction at the same time. And the result was a single sound, made of many parts. It filled the command deck of the times, certainty of return times, for approximately 12 seconds. Nobody said anything. Dret looked like he had been slightly struck by something small and invisible. The navigation officer, a woman named Cirrus who had done 47 border patrols and was not easy to impress, had stopped her work entirely and was simply listening. Alos reached over and cut the audio feed. That is what the crew of a heavily damaged human warship is currently doing, he said. He was not speaking to anyone specific. He was speaking to the air, The way you speak when you are trying to make something real by saying it. They are singing. Nobody confirmed or denied this. Alos looked at the biometric data again. He found the section on performance metrics. The scan could estimate certain things about physical coordination, reaction speed, motor control, from the patterns of movement it detected. He had asked for it because he always asked for it. It told you the fighting capacity of a crew. The times, unconditionals times crew showed impaired physical condition injuries logged, fatigue markers high. Several individuals showing signs of blood loss and unaddressed trauma. All of that was expected. What was not expected was their coordination score. It was high. Not high for a damaged crew. Not high for a crew under stress. High. Full stop. The kind of high that you saw in elite units during peak performance, not in broken ships drifting on the edge of the buffer zone after a battle they were supposed to have lost. The weapons array charged a little further. Alos sat very still. He had filed 40 reports on human vessel intercepts in 12 years. He had written the phrase, times anomalous human behavior, times so many times it had stopped meaning anything to him. It was just a box you checked, a category that explained away the things that did not fit into other categories. You wrote it and moved on, and went back to waiting for the transfer that was probably never going to come. He pulled up his incident report template. He started filling it in and got as far as the contact classification field. He sat there with his cursor in the field for almost a full minute. Then he opened a separate escalation form. Not the standard incident report. The emergency escalation, the one that went up the chain fast. The one that bypassed normal processing and landed on a senior analyst's desk within the hour. He had filed 2 of these in 12 years. The first was a genuine weapons discharge emergency. The second was a navigational crisis. He was about to file a third because a damaged ship was singing at him and its guns were charging on no power he could explain. He marked the incident classification. He typed it slowly, not because he wasn't sure, but because once you put something in writing it became real in a way it wasn't before. Anomalos human. Then, because the form had a field for additional notes, and he felt that additional notes were warranted, he typed, Vessel should be non-functional per engagement report filed 6 hours prior. Vessel appears to disagree with this assessment. Crew is in active synchronized vocalization. Weapons array charging with no identified power source. Request specialist review. Immediate. He sent it. He looked back at the times, unconditional times on the main display. She was still rotating. Still there. Still not going anywhere. The weapons array was at 62% charge now. Alos picked up his cold grain brew, looked at it, and put it down again. Dret, quietly, pulled the audio feedback up. Just low. Just barely audible. The singing filled the room again. Soft and layered and completely unexplainable. Coming from 23 humans on a ship that had no business still being in one piece. Let alone in this sector. Let alone alive. The navigation officer had gone back to her work. But she was tapping her finger in time with it. Alos did not tell her to stop. He was very busy trying to understand what he was looking at, and he suspected he was going to be busy with that for a long time. Outside, in the dark, the times, unconditional times held her position. Patient, breathing, waiting for whatever came next with the calm of something that had already decided none of it was going to stop it. The message arrived at Senior Analyst Sarastov's workstation at 0418. Which meant it had been routed as an emergency escalation, which meant someone in the Border Corps had seen something that made them nervous enough to use the fast channel. Saris read the first 3 lines of the report. Then she picked up her 4th arm, reached across her desk, and closed the research file she had been working on before the message arrived. Not because it was unrelated, because it was very related. And she needed a moment before she looked at both things at the same time. She had been working on the file for 6 years. It had started as a side project, something she worked on between official assignments because the official assignments were not asking the questions she thought needed asking. It had grown, slowly and then faster, the way things grow when you keep finding new evidence for something you already suspect. It was a model, a behavioral model, built from combat records and biometric scans and communication intercepts, and every piece of data on human military engagements that Consensus Archives contained. She had a name for it in her personal notes. The real problem. Her superiors, on the 2 occasions she had raised the subject at staff meetings, had called it overinterpretation. One of them had called it a hobby, in the tone people use when they mean times this is not real work and you should stop doing it. The other had been slightly kinder, which in practice meant he had told her she was asking interesting questions before redirecting her to the quarterly behavioral survey that needed updating. The quarterly behavioral survey was always needing updating. She opened the escalation report from Subcommander Alos fully now and read all of it. Then she pulled the raw scan data he had attached. She was going to do her job, which was to analyze this data and write an assessment and pass it up the chain. That was what she was here for. That was what she was good at. She had been good at it for 15 years, ever since she transferred out of the academic directorate under circumstances that still made her jaw tighten if she thought about them directly. She started with the reactor reading. Primary reactor. Offline. Cold. 72 hours. She cross-checked this against the engagement report from 6 hours ago. The times unconditional times had taken a direct hit to her reactor section during the engagement. The strike group commander had noted it as a kill shot. The reactor had gone critical and then dead, in the way reactors do when things go very wrong very fast. So the reactor was cold. Fine. Not surprising. She moved to the weapons array. Active. 62% charge at the time of the scan. Climbing. She looked at this for a while. A weapons array needs power. Power comes from a reactor or a secondary backup system. The primary reactor was cold. She searched the times unconditionals times ship specifications, which were in consensus archives. The consensus had made a point of collecting every available human technical document, which was somewhat easier than it sounded because humans published a remarkable amount about their own military hardware, a habit the consensus had spent years trying to understand and had eventually filed under Time's cultural anomaly. The Times unconditional times carried a secondary emergency power system. Capacity. Enough to run life support and basic communications for approximately 96 hours. Not weapons. Not at this draw level. The secondary system was not designed to run weapons. Saris checked the weapons array draw rate. She checked the secondary system capacity again. The math did not work. She wrote it out manually, long form, the way her first research mentor had insisted she write out calculations when something felt wrong, because writing it long form meant you caught the moment you made an assumption you shouldn't have made. She wrote it out 3 times. The math still didn't work. The times, unconditional times, was drawing more power for her weapons than her surviving systems could produce, which meant she was drawing it from somewhere else. Saris opened her model file times the real problem times and added a notation. A small one. Just a flag that said times power source unknown. See weapons data. Case file UCN 47. She had done this 41 times in 6 years. Added a notation. Added a flag. Another data point that said times this does not fit the framework we are using. 42 times now. She moved to the biometric data. This was where she lived. This was the center of her work. Biometrics, what a body was doing. What a body was telling you about the mind driving it. She had more hours reading human biometric data than anyone in the Consensus Research Corps. And she knew it, and she had stopped finding that interesting a long time ago because the data kept saying the same thing, and nobody was listening. 23 crew. Elevated stress markers. High cortisol. High adrenaline. Blood loss markers on 8 individuals, which meant 8 of the 23 were injured, some seriously. Standard for a ship that had been in a hard fight. She looked at the coordination metrics. Then she looked at them again, leaning closer, as if being physically nearer to the screen would help her understand what she was seeing. The coordination score, a composite metric that measured how well a crew was moving, communicating, and functioning as a unit, was at 91%. The standard for a fully rested, fully staffed, top-tier consensus combat crew was 87. 23 humans, injured, exhausted, on a ship with a cold reactor, were performing at a higher coordinated unit level than the best crews in the consensus fleet under ideal conditions. She sat back in her chair. This was not a new finding. This was what her model kept saying. This was what 42 data points said. The worse things got for human crews, the better they performed, right up until the point where they didn't, which was usually a point that was so far past anything. The consensus considered a rational cutoff that by the time it arrived, the surrounding environment had already been substantially damaged. She looked at the synchronized vocalization data. Unknown, Alos's translation suite had said. Saris's suite was better than the standard military-grade model. She had spent 8 months modifying it specifically for human cultural output analysis, which her supervisor had described as an unusual use of her discretionary research hours, and then had not stopped her from doing. She pushed the raw audio file through her modified translation framework. It took 11 minutes. The result was longer than times unknown. Musical composition, human origin, genre classification, folk, traditional, language, West African dialect compound, estimated primary language, Twi, Akan. Composition. Mourning tradition. Specifically adapted for communal loss. Translation approximate. We are still here. The ground has not taken us. We are still here. And we will be here when the morning finds us. Repeat structure. Continuous loop. Active participants. 23/23 crew members. Saris read that 3 times. A funeral song. They were singing a funeral song. Not for themselves, the phrasing wasn't about accepting death. It was about refusing to let death be the final word. We are still here. Over and over. 23 voices singing times. We are still here. Times on a ship that every official report said should be wreckage. She looked back at the weapons charge data. She pulled the timing. She overlaid the weapons charge rate against the vocalization data. Matching timestamps. The charge rate was higher during the periods of active vocalization. She overlaid them 3 more times to be sure. Not a little higher. Consistently, measurably higher. When all 23 crew were singing together, the weapons charged faster. When the singing paused for approximately 4 minutes in the middle of the recording, probably a meal break, she noted the charge rate dropped back to baseline. She opened her model. She opened the section she had titled, with the blunt honesty of someone who writes things they think no one else will read. The thing that shouldn't be true, but keeps being true. And she read what she had written 2 years ago, when she had started seriously working this angle. Human performance under stress does not follow the survival calculus. Every known sapient species shows a measurable decline in coordinated group function as conditions approach a survivability threshold. Humans show an increase. This increase is not individual. Individual human performance, under extreme stress, follows normal degradation curves. The anomaly is group performance. The anomaly is what they do together. Current hypothesis. Human group bonding creates something that functions like a combat multiplier, but operates through social, rather than biological or technological mechanisms. When the group is under threat, and the group responds as a unit, the unit performs beyond the sum of its parts. Problem. This is not how organisms work. Individual survival calculus should still dominate at the cellular level, regardless of social structure. The group behavior should begin to fracture as individual survival pressure increases. Why doesn't it fracture? She had been sitting with that question for 2 years. She looked at the 23 people singing on the broken ship. She thought she might have found a piece of the answer. She pulled the communication logs from the scan. Not the vocalization, the tactical communication, the operational chatter, the short burst messaging that crews use during damage control and system management. She put it through the full translation suite and started reading. Most of it was practical. System status, repair updates, power routing decisions. But the practical communication was broken up, constantly, by something else. Short exchanges. 3 words. 4 words. Sometimes just 1. She flagged them and isolated them. You doing okay? Right here. Still with me? Got you. Don't you dare. I'm here. She read through 147 of these short exchanges over a 6-hour period, on a ship that was managing a near-catastrophic systems failure in a potentially hostile sector, while injured and running on. Emergency power. 147 times, in the middle of everything else. Crew members had checked on each other. Had said, I see you. I know you're there. I have not forgotten about you. Saris leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a while. This was not tactical communication. This was not what she had been trained to classify as operationally relevant data. These were not reports, or orders, or system updates. But they were not nothing. They were something. She did not have the precise vocabulary for it in the consensus analytical framework, because the consensus analytical framework had been built for species that operated on the survival calculus, and the survival calculus was an individual equation. It asked, what do I need to survive? These humans were asking a different question, over and over, in the middle of a disaster, with a cold reactor and charging guns, and 22 other people depending on them. Each one of them was asking, are you still here with me? And the answer every time was, yes. She opened the new case file and began writing her assessment. She wrote it the way she always wrote reports. Clean, factual, careful. She wrote about the reactor discrepancy, and the weapons data, and the coordination metrics, and the vocalization timing. She wrote about what the data showed, and what it implied. She wrote, the way you write, when you know what you're saying, is going to make people uncomfortable. Then she got to the section on conclusions, and she stopped. She looked at her model. She looked at the data. She looked at the 42 flagged cases and this new one, and the sentence she had written 2 years ago times, "Why doesn't it fracture?" And she thought about 23 injured people on a dying ship singing to each other across every room and corridor and station, 147 times, asking times, "Are you still here?" 147 times. Hearing times. Yes. She knew why it didn't fracture. She had known for a while. She had just been waiting for someone to give her permission to say it, and she was starting to understand that permission was not coming, and she was going to have to say it without it. She wrote the conclusion. Human group cohesion under stress does not decrease because human beings are not fighting for themselves. Individual survival calculus applies to individual survival. These crew members are not trying to survive for their own sake. They are trying to survive for each other. The mechanism that should cause the group to fracture individual self-preservation, overriding group loyalty, does not activate because the individual's primary survival drive has been redirected. They want to live because the person next to them needs them to. This is not a battle tactic. It is not a cultural quirk. It is the functional structure of how human beings process threat. They do not ask, "Will I survive?" They ask, "Will you?" The consensus has been attempting to defeat an opponent by applying pressure to a threshold that does not exist in the way we assumed. She stopped there. She saved the document. She looked at the section of the report where she was supposed to attach supporting files. She opened her model, the one her supervisors called a hobby, the one with 42 data points and 6 years of work and the slowly building shape of something she was not supposed to have figured out. She attached it. She flagged the submission for immediate command review. She sent it before she could think about the career implications, which were not small. Then she pulled the audio feed one more time, the singing, and she sat with it in her office in the dark at 0500, with cold air recycled through a ship. She sometimes forgot was also carrying 26 other lives, and she listened to 23 humans on a broken vessel sing about still being here. They were still here. She filed that under accurate, outside the times certainty of returns times viewport. The times, unconditional times, kept rotating, kept charging, kept breathing. 12 consensus warships sat in a loose ring around her. She seemed unbothered. Fleet Commander Tashin Vor had been in command of a theater of active war for 3 years, and he was very good at knowing when data was lying to him. Data lied all the time. Sensors drifted. Observers filtered what they saw through what they expected to see. Reports were written by people who had careers to protect and reputations to maintain and supervisors who did not always want to hear the full story. Vor had learned, over 31 years of military service, to read past the surface of a report and find the shape of the real thing underneath. He read Sub-Commander Alos's escalation at 0500. He read Senior Analyst Saris Dobbs' assessment at 0520. He sat with both of them for a long time. He had 12 warships now positioned in a ring around the times unconditional. That had been a precaution. A human destroyer with active weapons and an unexplained power source in the buffer zone was a precaution situation, regardless of how damaged she looked. He had ordered the repositioning from his flagship while still half asleep and not yet fully aware of what he was repositioning around. He was fully aware now. He read Saris Dobbs' report a second time, more slowly. He had a vague memory of her name from somewhere. He searched his files. She had published a paper 3 years ago, early in the war, arguing that human combat behavior required specific study and that the consensus was misreading the data. He had received a summary of the paper from his research directorate with a note attached that said Times interesting theoretical work, not operationally relevant. He had filed it without reading it in full. He read the paper now. He read the model she had attached. He read 42 data points, 6 years of accumulated evidence, the same finding appearing in engagement after engagement. Human groups, under maximum pressure, perform better, not worse. The survival calculus does not apply the way it should. The mechanism for fracture does not activate. He sat with that. His coffee went cold. Outside his viewport, the times, unconditional times, continued her slow rotation, patient and unreasonable, like a problem that refused to resolve itself just because you stared at it long enough. He had been writing his after-action reports for 3 years. He was a careful, thorough writer. He documented what happened with the precision of someone who understood that records outlasted people, and that what got written down became what was true. His reports showed a consensus military that was managing a difficult conflict with steady progress, more territory, more resources, a gradual, measurable advantage. Saris Dobbs' model showed the same engagements from the other direction. The numbers were the same. The outcomes were the same. The interpretation was different. He had been measuring the wrong thing. He pushed that thought into a box. Not because it wasn't important. It was the most important thing he had thought in 3 years, but because the Times, unconditional Times, was still out there. Weapons at 73% charge now and climbing. And he needed to handle the immediate situation before he dealt with the larger one. He opened a command channel to his communications officer. "I want a direct line to the Times Unconditional," he said. "Standard military frequencies. Broad enough to catch whatever they're using." "Yes, sir. Do you want to wait for a protocol translation setup?" He thought about it. "No. Live translation only. I want to talk in real time." The channel opened. He waited. For a moment there was nothing but the quiet hiss of an open frequency. Then there was a click. The small sound of someone picking up a receiver or activating a local comm unit, and then a voice. A woman's voice. Slightly rough at the edges. Like someone who had been awake for too long or had been talking through smoke. Not panicked. Not formal. Something in between. The voice of a person who was tired and alert at the same time. "Unconditional Senior Chief Osei-Bonsu. Go ahead." Vor's translation suite processed this in real time, turning the English into his own language a beat after she spoke. A half-second delay that would be present through the whole conversation, like the short gap between lightning and thunder. He had expected a commanding officer. Rank-and-file protocol. He had a whole opening prepared in his head. Formal language. Military courtesy. The architecture of how civilized combatants talk to each other across a standoff. He had the structure of a surrender negotiation ready, wrapped in polite language that made it sound like an offer rather than a demand. He had not prepared for Time's senior chief. He looked her up in the database quickly. A reflex. Senior Chief Petty Officer Amara Osei-Bonsu, 34 years old, 14 years of service. Not the Times Unconditional's Times commanding officer. Not the executive officer. Not anyone on the command line that Vor would have expected to pick up the phone. The ranking, surviving crew member. He understood what that meant. He put his prepared opening aside and said, simply, "This is Fleet Commander Tashin Vor, commanding the Consensus Response Group. I am speaking to the crew of the Times Unconditional. We have your vessel surrounded. We are aware of your current situation. We would like to discuss terms." A pause. Not long. 2 seconds. He had the sense of someone processing information quickly. "What kind of terms?" she said. "Cessation of hostilities. Safe extraction for your crew. Medical assistance. We can see from our biometric scans that several of your people need treatment. Full compliance with consensus detainment protocols. Temporary. Pending the conflict resolution framework." He had said this, or a version of it, many times. It was a reasonable offer. It was, under the circumstances, a generous one. Another pause. Slightly longer. "We're good," she said. His translator rendered this, and he looked at it for a moment. "We're good." He asked for a secondary semantic parse. The secondary parse returned, colloquial expression indicating adequate status, declining a need or offer, informal register, high confidence. She had just told him no, in 2 words. "Senior Chief," he said carefully, "I want to make sure the translation is accurate. You are declining the offer of medical assistance and extraction? I'm saying we don't need it. Our scans show that 8 of your crew have significant injuries. We know. Your primary reactor has been offline for approximately 72 hours. We know that too." He looked at the scan data on the secondary screen beside him. "Weapons array now at 78%. We are also tracking your weapons array as actively charging. May I ask what you're charging it for?" A slightly longer pause. "Precaution," she said. He had been a fleet commander for 3 years and before that a ship captain for 9. He knew what precaution times meant in a tactical context. It meant, "I am preparing to shoot someone and I haven't decided who yet. I want to be direct with you," he said. "You are surrounded by 12 warships. Your reactor is offline. My analysts cannot identify how your weapons array is drawing power. I do not know if your weapons are actually functional, but I have to treat them as if they are." "That's fair," she said. Just that. "That's fair." He found himself uncertain about the next sentence for the first time in a long while. Every other conversation he had ever had in this position followed a recognizable shape. Fear was a language he spoke fluently. Desperation had a grammar. Even anger had a structure he could navigate. But this calm, this 2-word economy, this voice that sounded like someone discussing a mild inconvenience, rather than a situation where her ship was surrounded and outgunned, 12 to 1, he did not have the vocabulary for it. "Senior Chief," he said, "I am going to ask you a direct question and I would like a direct answer. Go ahead. Do you understand the tactical situation you are currently in?" He heard something in the background, on her end. A small sound, movement, the faint edge of another voice, not speaking to him. Someone nearby on the Times Unconditionals Times bridge. The Senior Chief was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. And in those 2 seconds he had the strong impression that she was looking at someone, turning her head, checking on someone who was near her. "Yes," she said. "We understand it. And you are choosing not to surrender. We're not in a surrender situation." He looked at his screen. He looked at the 12 warships. He looked at the scan data. He looked at the cold reactor and the weapons climbing toward a full charge. "I want to make sure I understand you correctly. You are one vessel. Your reactor has been cold for 3 days. You have 8 injured crew members. You are surrounded. What, from your perspective, is the nature of your current situation if it is not a surrender situation?" "A beat. An ongoing one," she said. He was quiet. The translation suite had nothing additional to offer. And he tried a different approach. "Our records show that your vessel was involved in an engagement in this sector 6 hours ago. The engagement report classifies the times. Unconditional times as neutralized." A short sound came across the channel. It was his translation suite processed it, ran it twice, and returned the same result both times: laughter. Not cruel laughter. Not mocking. The small, brief sound of someone who has just heard a description of themselves that they find slightly funny. "Yeah," she said. "We saw that report. You have access to consensus communications?" "We have access to a lot of things," she said. And then, before he could respond, "We'll take the medical supplies, though, if the offer's still open. We have a situation on Deck 7 that could use attention." Quote, he had not expected that. The pivot from times were not surrendering times to times, actually. Yes, the medicine would be good times was not a transition he had a tactical framework for. "The offer is still open," he said. "We appreciate it." A pause. Then, "Fleet Commander Vor, the transfer from your sector post to Interior Command is going to be approved." "I'd take it." He went very still. That was not in any data he had transmitted. His transfer request was in his personal command file, encrypted, on internal consensus systems. "How do you know about that?" he said. "You've been here a long time," she said simply. "You should go home." The channel was quiet for a moment. Then, "We're going to keep the weapons active. I hope that's okay." 1. She closed the channel. He sat in the command chair of his flagship for a long time without moving. He thought about the 42 data points in Sarastov's model. He thought about the word times, fracture times, and the reason it wasn't happening. He thought about 147 small exchanges on a broken ship, each one asking, "Times, are you still here?" Each one answering, "Times, yes." He thought about a woman on a dead ship who had just told him, "No, thank you, we're handling it, and also, you should go home," in the same voice. He opened Sarastov's model on his primary screen. He read all of it this time. Every data point. Every conclusion. The final paragraph. TAT. The one that said times the mechanism for fracture does not activate because the individual's primary survival drive has been redirected. The one that said times they want to live because the person next to them needs them. 2. He looked at the times, unconditional times on his tactical display. Weapons array. 83%. He ordered his fleet to hold position. He picked up his cold coffee, looked at it, and finally drank it anyway. Then he flagged Sarastov's model and his own assessment and Alos's original report and bundled them into a single priority transmission addressed to Consensus High Command, theater level, which was a channel he had used once in 3 years for an actual crisis. He titled the transmission, "The Calder problem requires immediate senior review." He attached a personal note that said, in its entirety, "I have been writing the wrong report for 3 years. I am writing the correct one now. Read the model first." He sent it. Outside, the times, unconditional times, held her position. She had not moved. She had not threatened. She had not done anything that could be classified, technically, as hostile action. She was just there, patient, in the way something is patient, when it has already decided that patience is not a sacrifice. The weapons array hit 87% and kept climbing. Vor wondered, for the first time, if the weapons were even the point. High Assessor Molnareth was the oldest person in Consensus High Command, which meant he was also the person most likely to remember the first time a human ship did something that didn't make sense. That had been 11 years ago. A single vessel, a smaller class than the Times, unconditional, caught at the edge of a consensus patrol sweep near what was then still disputed space. The patrol had been routine. The human ship was alone and outgunned, and the patrol commander had offered terms in the standard way, expecting the standard outcome. The human ship had declined. Not aggressively, almost politely. And then, it had proceeded to damage 2 consensus ships before being disabled. The patrol commander had filed an anomaly report. The instrument error assessment that had been attached to that report had been written by a 28-year-old junior analyst named Muln Ereth, who had looked at the data, decided it was a sensor malfunction, and moved on to the next file. He had been thinking about that for 11 years. The priority transmission from Fleet Commander Vor arrived at 0610 and was on Muln's desk by 0615, which was fast. Muln read the cover note first times. I have been writing the wrong report for 3 years. Times, and then called an emergency session of the High Command Assessment Panel for 0800. He did not sleep between 0615 and 0800. He spent that time reading Serostov's model. He read it the way he had read very few documents in his career, not critically, not looking for errors or weaknesses, not building a rebuttal. He read it like a man who already knows the answer to the question and is watching someone else arrive at it from a different direction and finds himself hoping they reach the same destination. They did. By 0745, the assessment chamber was filled. 6 high assessors, including Muln, 4 senior military advisors, 3 specialists in xenobiology and behavioral modeling, 2 communications directors who were there because they might be needed for rapid deployment if decisions came out of this session, and Serostov, sitting at the end of the table in the chair that was technically reserved for presenting analysts but was usually occupied by people with significantly more rank than she currently held. She looked like someone who had been awake all night, which she had been. She looked like someone who had been waiting a long time for this room, which she also had been. Muln opened the session by putting everything on the main display at once. All 43 cases. All the raw data. 11 years of engagements laid out chronologically, and across every one of them, the same curve, the human curve going in the wrong direction. Performance rising as conditions worsened. Groups holding together past any reasonable expectation. Ships, fighting past the point where fighting made any mathematical sense. The room looked at it. Senior military advisor Pell, who had spent 8 years opposing the theory that human behavior required specific strategic adjustment, who had called it alarmism in 2 separate official documents, who was the man who had written the note on Saris's original paper that said, Times interesting theoretical work, not operationally relevant. Times sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at 11 years of data and did not say anything for a long time. Walk us through it, Muln said to Saris. She stood. She did not look nervous exactly. She looked like someone who had rehearsed this and then decided the rehearsal was wrong and was doing it from scratch. She started with the Times unconditional, current situation, current readings, the conversation Vor had logged with Senior Chief Ose Bonsu. She put the conversation transcript on the display and let the room read it. We're good. An ongoing situation. The room read those 2 responses for a moment. This is one example, she said. This is 43 examples, and those are only the ones we have clean data for. I believe the actual number is every engagement on record. She pulled up the survival calculus model, the standard one, the one that consensus had used to design military doctrine for 4,000 years. She walked them through it. Under sufficient pressure, any sapient organism will prioritize individual survival. This causes groups to fracture. Fracture creates retreat. Retreat is the manageable outcome. We have been applying this pressure to humans for 11 years, she said. The fracture has not occurred. I want to explain why. She put the communication logs on screen. Not the tactical data, the short exchanges, the 147 small moments from the Times, unconditional Times alone. Still with me? Right here. Got you. Don't you dare. She let the room look at them. These are not anomalies, she said. These appear in every communication log we have for every human engagement. In the 30 seconds before a critical maneuver, crew members are twice as likely to exchange these short personal confirmations as at any other time. Before the hardest thing they are about to do, they tell each other they are still present. They say each other's names. An assessor to Muln's left, Yura, the youngest member of the panel, leaned forward. What is the functional purpose? Saris had been waiting for this question. That is the right question. The functional purpose is not tactical. It has no tactical value in the standard sense. It does not improve accuracy or processing speed or weapons output directly. She pulled up the weapons charge data from the times unconditional, the overlay that showed charge rate against vocalization timing. Except it does, she said. Indirectly, measurably, when the crew is in active synchronized social bonding, communicating, naming each other, singing, their performance as a unit increases. The weapons charge faster, not because the weapons changed, because the people running the systems changed. Assessor Pell spoke for the first time. You're saying the mechanism is social. I'm saying the mechanism is social, and the consensus doctrine has been looking for a biological or technological explanation for 11 years, and finding nothing because it has been looking in the wrong category. The room was quiet. Muln looked at the data curve, the one that went up when it should go down. What are they protecting? He said. When they refuse to fracture, what is the organism protecting? Saris turned to him. This was the question she had spent 6 years building toward. Each other, she said. Not themselves, not the mission objective, not territory or strategic value. The individual human in a combat group is willing to exceed their individual survival calculus, willing to push past the point where survival is statistically likely, specifically to protect the other members of the group. The group cohesion is not a side effect of the survival drive. It is the survival drive. They have redirected it. Quote, Pell said, that is not how survival instinct works. For every species we have previously studied. No, she said. For humans, the data says otherwise. 43 cases. 11 years. The pattern does not have an exception. Muln thought about the first case, the one he had filed as instrument error. He thought about what would have been different if he had filed it correctly. He thought about 11 years. What does this mean strategically? Yura asked. Saris took a breath. It means the doctrine is wrong. The doctrine assumes that sufficient pressure applied to a sufficiently large human force will trigger the survival calculus at individual level, causing the group to fracture. We have been increasing pressure for 11 years. The group has not fractured. The group has, in many cases, become more cohesive under increased pressure, because increased pressure causes individual humans to invest more heavily in the social bond. She paused. We have been doing the opposite of what we intended. The harder we fight, the more tightly they hold together. The chamber was very quiet. Muln looked at the other assessors. Pell was still looking at his hands. Yura was looking at the data curve. The military advisors were doing the math that none of them wanted to do out loud. The attrition model, one of the advisors said finally. The words came out carefully, like he was placing them gently on the table. If the fracture threshold doesn't exist, then the attrition model does not work, Saris said. You cannot win a war of attrition against an organism that becomes more cohesive as it loses. There it was, the shape of the real thing. Muln had seen it coming for the last 40 minutes. From the first moment, he had read her model at 0, 6, 1, 5, and sat with the cold truth of it in his quiet office. But hearing it said aloud in the chamber, in front of all 6 assessors and 4 advisors, in the language of official military assessment, it was different. He looked at 43 data points. He thought about the times unconditional, out there right now with a cold reactor and active weapons and 23 people singing a funeral song. And he thought about how the song meant, times, we are still here, times, and how the weapons were charging anyway, and how Vor had told the senior chief she was surrounded by 12 warships, and she had said, times, that's fair, times, and closed the channel. He thought about a woman on a broken ship who knew the name of a transfer request that lived in an encrypted personal file. The communication logs, he said to Saris. You have them from multiple engagements. They use each other's names before critical maneuvers. Yes. Why? Saris considered this for a moment. I believe it is a reminder of what they are protecting. Before they do the hardest thing, they say, here is the reason. Here is the name of the reason. She paused. The name does what a battle order cannot. It makes the reason present, real. Muln sat with that. He was 61 years old. He had served the consensus for 38 of those years. He had been in 3 wars, not counting this one. And he had approached each of them with the same foundational assumption, that the beings on the other side of the conflict, no matter how strange or unlike him, operated on the same fundamental calculus. Survive, persist. When the math gets bad enough, stop. He had been wrong once before, when he was 28. He had written times, instrument error times, and moved on. He was not going to do that again. He closed the main display. Analyst of, he said, Your model. The conclusion. Read it. She read it. Out loud, in the formal chamber, in front of all of them. The part about individual survival drives being redirected. The part about fighting for each other, rather than for themselves. The last line. The consensus has been attempting to defeat an opponent by applying pressure to a threshold that does not exist in the way we assumed. She finished reading. Nobody challenged it. Muln looked at Pell. Pell looked back at him. Something passed between them that was not comfortable, and was not resolved, and was not going to be resolved in this room today. We need to discuss what comes next, Yura said. Yes, Muln said. We do. He stood and walked to the viewport. They were in the interior, far from the border, far from the buffer zone where the times, unconditional times, was drifting and charging and holding. Through the viewport there was space, the standard view, stars, and dark. He thought about the Calder engagement 11 years ago, the instrument error report, the box he had checked, and the file he had moved on from. He thought about everything that had been built on top of that decision. We are going to open a formal communication channel, he said, above theater level, the kind we use before a negotiation. The room was quiet. Sir, one of the advisors said carefully, there is still the question of the current strategic position. The current strategic position, Muln said, is that we have been applying the wrong strategy for 11 years and a single broken ship is currently demonstrating it to us in real time. He turned from the viewport. Open the channel. Oh. He looked at Sarastov. She was still standing at the presentation end of the table, with her model on the screen behind her, and 43 data points still visible, and 6 years of work that nobody had wanted to read until now. Well done, he said. He did not say it the way commanders say it when they mean time, sit down, you're finished. He said it the way you say something when you mean it. Simply, without ceremony. She nodded once and sat down. The room began to move. Advisors pulling up communication protocols. Yura drafting preliminary framework documents. Pell sitting quietly, not moving, looking at the data curve that went up when it should go down. Muln returned to his chair. He opened the communication log from the Times Unconditional. He found the section Cirrus had flagged the short exchanges. The names, the 147 confirmations that each person on that ship was still there. He read them. He found, somewhere at the back of his mind, a question he didn't have an answer to yet. If you had no one beside you, what were you fighting for? He set it aside. There was work to do. Outside, somewhere in the buffer zone. The Times, unconditional Times, was still holding her position, patient, unreasonable, alive. While the Consensus High Command had been in session for 14 hours, the Times, unconditional Times, had not been idle. Sarastov knew this because she had stayed patched into the live sensor feed from the Times, certainty of return, Times the entire time, running it on a secondary screen while she sat in the assessment chamber and presented her model and listened to assessors ask the questions they should have been asking years ago. The feed was small, tucked in the corner of her screen. Easy to miss. She had not missed it once. In the first 2 hours after the formal session started, the Times Unconditional's Times crew had managed to restore partial power to 2 of her 3 secondary systems. Not enough to run weapons at full capacity, not enough to give them speed, but enough to stabilize life support at a level that was not dangerously low, and enough to bring one of the dark sensor arrays back online, which meant the Times Unconditional Times could now see everything around her a little more clearly. Cirrus noted this in her personal file and then noted that the Times Unconditional's Times crew had done it in approximately 1/3 of the time her engineering estimates said it should have taken. She added the case to her model. 44, in hour 6. During a break in the session when the assessors were reviewing documents, and she was standing near the back wall with a cup of water she hadn't drunk yet. She pulled the live communication log from the Times Unconditional. The feed was running passive everything. The sensor array picked up, logged automatically, translated in real time. She read an hour's worth of it. They were still talking to each other the way they always talk to each other. Repair updates, system status. How's Deck 7? Any improvement? And underneath the practical, the same short personal exchanges. The names. The confirmations. Eat something. I will in a minute. Now, Ria? Fine, I'm eating. She read those 4 lines 3 times. She did not know who Ria was. She knew Ria was on the Times Unconditional. She knew Ria had apparently not eaten recently enough that someone had noticed and said something about it. She knew that in the middle of a 14-hour standoff with 12 enemy warships, Someone had stopped what they were doing to make sure Rhea ate. She drank her water. She went back into the chamber. By hour 10, the weapons array had reached full charge and held there, steady and patient. The times, unconditional times, had not fired. She had not moved. She had not transmitted anything to the consensus ships surrounding her beyond the basic navigation transponder pulse that said times. I am here. This is my position. The same signal a drifting asteroid makes. The same signal anything makes, when it simply exists in a place and wants to be acknowledged as existing. At hour 12, the sensor feed showed a change in the thermal signatures inside the ship. Saris ran a quick analysis. Several crew members had gathered in what the ship schematics listed as the crew mess hall. There was a thermal signature consistent with a food preparation unit being active. They were making a meal. She checked the time. By human reckoning, she had the human daily cycle cross-referenced because she had spent 6 years building the most comprehensive human behavioral database in the consensus. It was a mealtime. The consensus fleet had been running combat readiness protocols for 14 hours. The Times Unconditionals Times crew had decided it was dinner time and acted accordingly. Saris wrote one sentence in her model notes. Social rhythms maintained under active standoff conditions. Group normalcy preservation is a stress response, not a luxury. She paused. Then she added, they know exactly what they're doing. At hour 14, the formal session ended, and Molnirath gave the order to open the high-level channel. Saris returned to her own workstation, the small one she had been at since 0418 this morning, and she watched the communication protocols being established on one screen while keeping the sensor feed on the other. The high-level channel going up to Consensus High Command, this was the channel that meant something. Not a patrol commander making a tactical offer, not a theater commander in over his head. This was the channel that historically, in 4,000 years of consensus diplomatic history, preceded the serious conversations. Amara Ose Bonsu would understand what it meant. Saris was almost certain of this, the same way she was certain of most things she had spent 6 years figuring out about how human beings thought. While the protocol was still being established, a separate signal came through, not to the command channel, not to the fleet network, to Saris's personal research channel, which had a small indicator light on her workstation that had never lit up with an external contact before. Her research channel was not a widely known address. It was not in the standard directory. You had to look specifically for it to find it. The signal was from the Times Unconditional. She opened it. It was audio. The voice from Vor's log, Senior Chief Ose Bonsu, slightly less rough now than she had been 14 hours ago, which meant she had also eaten and probably slept a little, or at least rested, because they were careful about that kind of thing. Saris knew this from the logs. We've been watching your ship's scan pattern since about hour 3, the Senior Chief said. You ran deep biometric 6 times. Wasn't the commander he was running tactical? The biometric pattern was different, thorough. Someone was paying attention to specific things. I figured that was you. Saris looked at the communication request. She opened the two-way channel. How did you find my research channel? She said. Pause. Not long. You published a paper 3 years ago, the one arguing that human behavior needed specific study. The submission headers still had your contact routing in them. It took about 4 minutes. Saris thought about that paper, about the meeting where she had presented it, about the word times hobby. Did you read it? She asked. Yeah. A brief pause. Your model's right. I wanted you to know that. From our end, looking at it from the inside, you have it right. Saris looked at her screen for a moment. 6 years. 44 data points. The model that nobody wanted to read until the Times. Unconditional Times. Made it impossible to ignore. Thank you, she said. She kept the rest of what she was thinking out of her voice, which took some effort. You're welcome, said Amara Ose Bonsu. Then, after a beat, also, we have extra rations. We made too much. If anyone over there wants some, we're not going anywhere. Saris looked at that communication for a moment. A broken ship offering food to the fleet surrounding it. She thought about the short exchanges in the logs. Eat something. Now, Rhea. The particular care of people who know, in their bones, that bodies need tending, especially when tending them, feels like an interruption. I'll pass that along, Saris said. The channel stayed open for a few seconds. Not because either of them had more to say. Just the open frequency, the small space of it. The high-level channel that's going up right now, Amara said. That's a good sign. Who's sending it? High Assessor Mulnerath. A very short pause. Tell him I said good morning. Saris checked the time. It was evening, local station. It's not morning. It will be by the time he's ready to talk, said Amara Osebonsu, and there was something in her voice that was not quite a smile and not quite certainty, and was maybe both at the same time. The channel closed. Saris sat at her desk in the quiet of a workstation that had been running for over 18 hours, and she looked at the sensor feed. The Times Unconditional, on the feed, was a shape, a damaged shape, lopsided from the porthole compromise, listing slightly in the slow rotation she had been doing since the beginning. The weapons array was a steady line on the readout. Full charge, holding. She pulled the last hour of the communication log. She read it the way she had been reading all of them, looking for the pattern, the fingerprint of the thing she had been trying to explain to people for 6 years. How's the shoulder? Better. Stiff. You should wrap it again before your next rotation. Already did. Liar. I'm going to do it right now. Happy? Extremely. She read them. All of them. The practical and the personal braided together, impossible to separate because for these people they were not separate, had never been separate. The work and the care existed in the same breath. She thought about Molnirath asking, "What are they protecting?" She thought about her answer. She opened her model. The conclusion section. She read what she had written and thought about whether it was still what she wanted to say. It was. She added one paragraph below it. Note: the mechanism is not complicated. It does not require specialized biology or technology, or a structure that differs from any other sapient species in fundamental ways. The mechanism is this. Humans practice noticing each other. They practice it constantly, in the smallest possible moments, until it becomes the thing they do without thinking. The reflex that says, before anything else, is the person next to me still there? This practice, accumulated over years and decades, produces a group that does not fracture under pressure, because fracturing would require each individual to stop noticing. And they cannot stop. They have practiced too long. The weapon is attention. The armor is memory. The power source is the specific weight of one particular name. We have no unit of measurement for it. We never will. She saved the model. She looked at the sensor feed one more time. The Times Unconditional Times was still there. She would be there when the high-level channel finished establishing. She would be there when the first formal communication went through, the kind that meant the serious conversations were beginning. She would be there in the morning, when Molnirath finally read out across the high channel, and she would be there after that. Not because she couldn't leave, because she had 22 reasons to stay. On the sensor feed, the thermal signatures inside the Times Unconditional Times shifted slightly. Some of them dimmed sleep patterns, crew resting in rotation the way military crews rest, never all at once, always with someone watching. Others stayed bright, people working, repairing, monitoring. One bright signature moved through the ship in a path that Saris's experience of 6 years told her was a check. Around, someone walking the length of the ship, passing through each section, pausing briefly at each station, checking on each one, making sure. The weapons array held at full charge, steady, a line that did not waver. Somewhere in the buffer zone, between the consensus fleet and the human border systems, the Times Unconditional Times breathed, not waiting to be saved, not counting down to an end, just there. The way something is there, when it has already decided that time's there, Times is exactly where it intends to be. And the universe is welcome to form an opinion about that. And the universe's opinion is, at the end of the day, noted and not particularly decisive. Sarah's Dove shut off her overhead light and kept the sensor feed running. She watched the Times Unconditional Times in the dark. She watched the bright signatures inside her, the living warmth of 23 people who had been told they were neutralized and had disagreed quietly and completely. And she thought about all the things her model had gotten right and the one thing it had not quite said. It was not that humans didn't know how to stop. It was that they kept finding, every time they considered stopping, one more name, one more reason, one more person whose face was in their head when the hardest moment came. And that was always, always enough. The high-level channel finished establishing at 0214. The message that came through was formal, official, above theater level. The kind that meant, we would like to talk. The Times Unconditional Times received it. She responded in 40 seconds. Amara Osebonsu's voice came across the high channel, into high command, into the room where Molnirath was sitting with the weight of 43 data points and 11 years, and one instrument error report that had cost more than he had understood at the time. She called him by his name. He checked his records afterward, the way Vor had. She had not received it in any transmission. It was not in any data. The Times unconditional Times had been given access to. He never found out how she knew it. He decided, after a while, that it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had known it, and she had said it. And when she said it, for just a moment, the High Assessor of the Verith Consensus sat in his formal chair in his formal chamber and felt, with a clarity that surprised him, like a person, like a specific person, like someone whose name, in someone else's mouth, was a particular and unrepeatable thing. He understood, in that moment, what the weapon was. He began to talk.